In this initial 3ds Max video, we'll cover key aspects of the interface, navigation, some basic tools in object manipulation, and how to set a couple preferences to make life easier for you working on your first 3D project. But please keep in mind that we will not be covering everything there is to know about 3ds Max in these tutorials, because that simply wouldn't be possible. There's just too much involved to touch upon everything you could or might want to learn about. We'll cover what I think are the more important topics, tools, and procedures, and the ones that I think are particularly relevant for what you'll be doing in this course. But you are welcome and encouraged to explore and experiment and read about anything you want to read about in relation to 3ds Max. The 3ds Max help documentation can be found in the help menu, and it's a searchable, very well written and organized collection of written information and video tutorials as well. I highly recommend you keep the 3ds Max help open while you work and get used to it as a constant companion as you learn the software. I also want to touch upon some general comments about learning 3D software in general and 3ds Max specifically. So let's start there. All consumer-level software, and as far as it can be, is designed for novice users to operate without prior experience. And in service to that goal, the software designers imbue the interface and the organization with features to help you, the novice user, learn and implement the software as quickly and easily as possible. The menu names, for example, are named strategically to indicate where you might find the operations or tools you're looking to use. So for example, if you were looking to open a file, save a file, import or export files, and you had to guess which of these menus you might find those options under, chances are that your first, maybe your second choice would be the file menu, and that in fact is where you go to open, save, import, and export file. If you were looking to create objects, such as the sphere that I have here in this file, which menu might you find that option? Well, chances are, if you had to make a logical guess, even without any prior experience, one of your first guesses might be the create menu, and that in fact is where you find how to make this sphere. Tooltips are the little bits of text that pop up when you hold your mouse over the button. The buttons themselves have icons that are meant to indicate what those buttons do. You hold your mouse over any of these buttons, a little piece of text will tell you what that button is. It works the same for the parts of the interface. If I hold my mouse button over here, that tells me that this is the Scene Explorer. If I hold my mouse button over here, that tells me that that is the command panel. These features are particularly important for 3D software because it's very difficult to try to learn them by memorizing procedures, because there's so much to these applications and there's simply too much to try to memorize. So strategically named menus and panels, icons, tooltips, they all allow you to focus your energy on understanding the whys and the whats of the software instead of trying to memorize the hows. So all of this is to say that while 3ds Max, or Maya for that matter, are some of the most challenging and complex graphics software there is, and it's perfectly natural that they could be intimidating for you as a new user, there are inherent features that are designed to help you logic your way through them. So try to keep that in mind as you begin working with 3ds Max. Okay, before we get started with the interface and navigation, let's set a couple of preferences to make life easier for you working on your first 3D project. The software preferences can be found in two different areas, under the File menu, Preferences, or under the Customize menu, Preferences. They both take you to the same place. And the first one I wanted to talk about is on the General tab, and it's the number of undos that are available to you. By default, this number will be set to 10. That may seem like plenty, but as a new user, you want to give yourself a little bit more rope. So I'm going to suggest that you set that up to 100. And that way, you could undo up to 100 steps if you make a mistake, and that will be far more than you'll ever really need to use. The second preference is the interaction mode, which determines the combination of keyboard keys and mouse buttons that work together to navigate within the camera views and switch between viewports. All Autodesk applications, 3D applications, 3ds Max, Maya, Mudbox, Motion Builder, allow you to work with one set of keys and buttons for all of those applications, which is a nice feature because, trust me, it can get confusing switching between them when you work with multiple applications on a regular basis. I'm going to strongly advise you to choose the Maya option for any and all of the apps, even if you work solely with 3ds Max, because I think the Maya interaction mode is the simplest and most intuitive set of navigational shortcuts, and it's the quickest to assimilate and get comfortable with. And that's really the most important part. For you, it's going to take some time and practice. Getting comfortable with the navigational shortcuts will drastically improve and speed up your workflow. So I'll set this to Maya and hit OK, and that will save both that preference and the level of undos at 100. So with the Maya interaction mode set, pressing the space bar maximizes the viewport over which your mouse lies at the time and takes you back out into this foreview. So anywhere my mouse lies, and I click the space bar, that's going to maximize that particular view. And you can get comfortable moving in and out, because as you work, you're going to be going into individual views and then back out into the foreview and into another view. So get used to pressing that space bar, and this is one of the main reasons why I suggest you choose the Maya interaction mode, because if this were a 3ds Max interaction mode, you would have to hit Alt-W to maximize your view and then come back out of it. And that's a little bit more cumbersome. There are 4 viewport cameras displayed by default. The perspective camera, which is a free-floating camera you can navigate in all 3 axes. And then 4 cameras called axonometric views, which is a fancy way of saying they are cameras without perspective or in which you can navigate in only 2 axes. Let's look at the perspective view first. So I'll press the space bar to bring that one up. There are basically 3 ways of navigating the perspective camera: orbiting or tumbling, panning, and zooming. With the My Interaction mode reset, tumbling is accomplished with the Alt and left mouse button. So if I press down Alt and hit the left mouse button and drag it, I'm tumbling around the scene. So whatever object I have framed at the time, or object, you can frame multiple objects, that is the point around which the camera rotates. So if I move the camera over here and tumble, I'm now tumbling around a different area. But if I wanted to frame this sphere and tumble around that, I would simply select the sphere, press the F key on my keyboard, which is the hotkey for frame selected, and then when I click Alt and drag the left mouse button, I'm tumbling around that sphere as the center. Panning is performed with the Alt and middle mouse button, and that moves the camera parallel to the view, either left to right or right to left, or up to down and down and up. So if I hit Alt and drag my middle mouse button, I can pan the camera from left to right and up or down. Zooming is done with the Alt and the right mouse button. Also, if you have a wheel on your mouse, that will also work for zooming, but that increases and decreases the magnification. So by pressing Alt and the right mouse button, I can zoom out or zoom in. And those are really the 3 ways you'll navigate the perspective camera. And you want to practice those so it becomes second nature. I mean, it's going to take some time for you, but tumbling, panning, and zooming is how you'll move around your models and your elements and your scenes. In the axonometric viewports, the top camera, bottom camera, front camera, back camera, left camera, and right camera, you can pan with the Alt and middle mouse buttons or zoom with the Alt and right mouse buttons, but you cannot tumble those axonometric cameras because there are only 2 axes with which you can navigate. In the top camera, for instance, and I can set this to be any camera I want, but for each of these axonometric views, there's a corresponding camera on the other side. So I'm in the top view now, I could switch that to the bottom view. So in the top view, I can Alt and middle mouse button to pan my view in both directions. I can use the Alt and right mouse button to zoom in and out, but I can't tumble. You can see I get a little stop sign when I try to do that because there is no depth in this view. In the top view or the bottom view, you're only seeing the y-axis, which is in this direction, and the x-axis in this direction. The z-axis, which is the one that you're looking straight at, doesn't exist, and that's why you can't tumble in that view. In the front view, which again I could also switch to the back view, but in the front or back view, I'm looking at the z-axis in this direction, the x-axis in this direction, and the y-axis I'm looking down at. So I can, again, pan in these directions, zoom in and out, but I can't tumble. In the left camera, which I could also switch to the right, I can see the z-axis in this direction, the y-axis in this direction, and it's the x-axis that I'm looking directly at. So again, I can pan or zoom, but I cannot tumble. While there are other ways to work with the viewport cameras, for instance using this view cube, which allows me to switch to different angles here, it's really important that you get comfortable working with the combination of the mouse buttons and the keyboard keys, because having to rely on something like the view cube would make your workflow very slow. So it's really important that you spend some time, especially in this first week, getting comfortable tumbling, panning, and zooming. It will dramatically increase your productivity and it will help you to acclimate to working in 3-dimensional space. Now let's go over a few of the main elements in the interface that you'll use most often. Again, I won't touch on everything, and you're welcome to read about all the interface elements in the 3ds Max help. So we went over viewports, which is where you'll be manipulating, moving, rotating, and scaling objects and sub-objects. On the left here is the Scene Explorer, which lists all of the objects and elements you create in your scene. Right now I only have this sphere that I created. It's called Sphere 001 by default. I didn't create that name, the software did that. If I created another sphere, it would be named Sphere 002. I can hide it or show it with the visibility icon here. I can freeze it or unfreeze it with this snowflake icon. Freezing makes the object unselectable, so while I can still see it, I cannot select it when it's frozen. The timeline down here, which we'll use when you begin animating objects later in the course, deals with time. There's the time slider, and these tick marks here represent frames, typically 30 frames per second for video, 24 frames per second for film, but each one of these tick marks is 1 frame. There are the time controls here, which look like what you would find in your DVD player. Play, go to the start, go to the end, move back 1 frame, move forward 1 frame. This allows you to switch between moving 1 frame forward or moving from each keyframe to keyframe, which you'll learn about later in the course. There are the animation controls. This button sets keyframes on objects. The auto key button, which will allow you to automatically set keyframes for any object when you change values, as long as you've set an initial keyframe for that object. The set key mode, which allows you to create keys for individual tracks using a combination of the set key button here and key filters, which you'll learn about later in the course. Over on the right, we have the command panel, which is actually 6 different panels that allow you to create, edit, animate, and display objects, sub-objects, and parameters of those objects. The create panel is where you'll create primitives, particles, objects such as foliage, doors, windows, etc. There's a drop-down menu that allows you to change the category of object you create. These correspond to elements on the create menu in 3ds Max or Maya for that matter. The buttons and other parts of the interface correspond to menu options. The modify panel, which is where you will set options for the objects that you create. It's where you'll add modifiers to edit and manipulate those objects. The hierarchy panel is where you go to manage links between objects, change the pivot point for object, which is the point from which they move, rotate, or scale. Edit hierarchies, which are how objects are linked or grouped to one another. The motion panel offers controls for animation controllers and trajectories. Probably use this later in the course when you're animating your object. The display panel lets you change the display of objects, show or hide objects or types of objects, freeze and unfreeze. You can change whether you display the object's color, which is the display color that you provide to it, or the material once you create materials and textures for that object. You can hide by category, so I could hide all of the geometry. If you had skeletons in here, you could hide just the skeletons. We can hide objects that we select. We can hide unselected objects, hide by name, which takes you to the Scene Explorer and allows you to choose which objects to show or hide by name. We can freeze or unfreeze objects in the same manner, and we can display elements of individual objects. Right now, I could display the vertices on the object to be always visible, whether it's selected or not, and you'll use this as you go on later in the course more often. Finally, there's the utilities panel, which contains different utilities that we probably won't be touching on in this course. You'll probably learn that later on in your time with 3ds Max. On top, we have the menu bar, which contains all of the menus that you can use. Underneath that is the main toolbar. This contains the most commonly used buttons: undo, redo, linking and unlinking objects, selecting in different ways, moving, rotating, scaling, changing the reference coordinate system, snapping. You'll probably end up using all of these buttons at some point in your project. There are also common operations for which you'll want to get comfortable using the hotkeys, especially early on. Control and Z is undo, Control and Y is redo, select is Q, move is W, rotate is E, and scale is R. And those are probably the most common hotkeys that you'll use as you work. There are different options for dragging selections. You can drag a rectangular shape to select objects, drag a circular shape. This is a magnetic lasso, allows you to create geometric shapes for your lasso for selection. The next one is a freeform lasso tool. This will come in more handy as you begin to work with the sub-objects like vertices and edges on objects. And then a spray selection, which you probably won't use too much in this course. But each one of these options change every time you hit the Q button. So hitting that Q button will cycle through those options. So let's go into greater depth about how do we transform those objects, how do we move, rotate, and scale them. So again, the W key on your keyboard is the select and move, and that will bring out what we call the gizmo, which is this object that looks like these 3 arrows coming off. This gizmo will change appearance depending on whether you're moving, rotating, which again is the E key on your keyboard, or scaling, which is R. But to demonstrate, I'm going to stick with the move key. So I can move this object with the gizmo in all 3 axes at once by clicking on the yellow square in the middle of it and dragging. So I'm now moving this object in all 3 axes at once. And I can also move them by 2 axes at a time. So if I wanted to move the object in the X axis, which is the red one, and the Z axis, which is the blue one, I can click on the square that corresponds to those 2 axes. So now I'm moving in the X and the Z axis. I could move in the Z and the Y axis. So Z is the blue one going up and down, and Y is the green one going this direction. If I click and drag on the square that corresponds to the 2 of those, I'm now moving the objects in the Z and Y axis. And then again, I can move it in the X and Y axis as well. I can also move in only one axis at a time. So if I click on just the blue Z arrow and drag this, I'm now moving just in the Z axis. I can move just in the X axis, just in the Y axis. So learning how to use the gizmo is really important as you begin to model and begin to arrange your objects in your scene. There are several different options you can use for the coordinate system you want to use when you're moving, rotating, or scaling objects. It can use a different setting for any object or element you select. I'm just going to go over the ones you might need to use when you work on this project in this course, but again, you can read about all of them in the 3ds Max help. World is a fixed coordinate system, or a fixed set of axes in all viewports, in which positive x is to the right in this direction, negative x would be to the left, positive y is forward, negative y is back, and then positive z is up and negative z is down. So when we have the world option set from our reference coordinate system drop-down menu, we're moving that object in the world coordinate no matter which direction our camera is facing when we're moving that object. So that axis remains the same regardless of which angle I'm looking at the object. Screen is the set of axes in relation to the active viewport. So if we set the coordinate system to screen and tumble the view, you can see that the axis displayed in the lower left-hand corner rotates the view as I tumble. So each time it's going to update and remain in this direction. So unlike the world coordinate where that axis was moving with the camera as I moved, this set of axes is dependent on the view. The view option is a cross between the world and screen coordinate systems. The top, left, and right views, as well as the counterpart views, the bottom view, the back view, the right view, use the screen coordinate system. Local uses the axis of the selected object based on its pivot point. So if I change the angle of the pivot for this sphere, and don't worry about it, we'll go over this in greater detail in a later tutorial, but I'm just going to change the pivot here. If I change the angle of the pivot, Local allows me to move the object based on the object's pivot point, and that remains fixed regardless of what direction I'm looking at that object. So that is based on the pivot point for the object. The working coordinate system is sort of like a secondary pivot point that you can set for objects. So later on, if you wanted to move some of the sub-objects of this sphere from a different point than the pivot point for the object itself, you can set and use that working pivot point. But again, we'll go over that in greater detail in a later tutorial. Lastly, I want to go over setting the project folder, which will help you organize where your scene files are saved. And in the future, where the ancillary files like texture images and the videos and images you render, where they will be saved as well. And I also want to make a very important point about saving often and incrementally to avoid losing work. To set the project folder, as you might expect, that option is under the File menu. And when I set project folder, it's by default 3ds Max when you install it, it sets the default project to the Documents folder, 3ds Max, AutoBack. So I'm going to change that and make a new folder. And you should make a new folder every time you begin a new project. So I'm going to put this in my Documents, and I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this GRA 202 Final Project. And make sure that that is loaded up. It still says new folder. But make sure you select that folder you created before you hit OK. And once you hit OK, when you make this folder now, in my documents, you'll see that I have a folder called GRA 202 Final Project, and within that folder is a number of subfolders. This is basically how all of your work is going to be organized. So now back in 3ds Max, when I save this file, it's automatically saving to the Scenes folder of that project that I set. So that GRA 202 Final Project folder structure is where all of the files that I create, use, and render will be contained. So if I wanted to or needed to move this project to another computer, or when I archive my work, I can simply select that main GRA 202 Final Project folder and know that all of the files, everything associated with this project, will be moved with that file. Saving your work responsibly is the most important habit you must develop, especially when working in 3D. I guarantee you that at some point during at least one of these tutorials that I create for this series, my software or my laptop will crash, or both. I will not edit that out of the tutorial. I'll edit out the time it takes for me to reboot, but it's important for you to realize that 3D software will crash at some point, and your computer, especially when working with 3D software, will crash at some point. In order to avoid losing work, you must save often and incrementally. Simply saving over the same file over and over again is a recipe for disaster. Not only can you not get back to an earlier state in your work, but if that file gets corrupted or deleted accidentally, you can be left with nothing. So you should save a different file every time you make a significant step forward as you work. When I work on let's say a vehicle modeling project for a client, for example, I might save the first file as vehicle model 01. And when I make a significant step forward, I will save the next file as vehicle model 01A. And then the next step that I accomplish, 01B, 01C. And then when I finish a certain point, let's say I finish the main body of the vehicle, at that point I would switch over to saving the file as vehicle model 02. And then the next step is vehicle model 02A, 02B, 02C. When that modeling project is finished, I may end up with 100 or more working 3ds Max files. And once I've delivered that project to the client, I might delete 95 of them. But this practice ensures that I never lose more than a few minutes of work at the most. And I can always go back to an earlier stage if need be. It is crucial that you see this practice not as a chore or a suggestion, but as a crucial responsibility that is entirely in your best interest. Your software is automatically set to back up your files every 5 minutes, and that can be found in the Customize in the Preferences menu. Under Auto Backup, you could increase that number. Mine is set to save every 5 minutes, a total of 3 files. You could increase the number of files you save and decrease the minutes so that it saves every 3 minutes if you wanted to be really safe. But that's not a substitute for saving your own work, often incrementally, because sometimes if the software crashes and that backup file isn't made, you can end up losing some work because it really only saves, in this case, every 5 minutes. So if I crash between those 5 minutes, I may end up losing some work. Okay, so I think that's more than enough for this tutorial. Hopefully this was a good primer to prepare you for your first 3D project. Remember, try not to get overwhelmed with terminology at this point. Don't feel that you have to commit everything we covered to memory. Focus first and foremost on practicing with the viewport navigation controls so you can switch between views, so that you can tumble, pan, and zoom in all of these views, change to different views, and practice moving, rotating, and scaling with the gizmo. But more than anything else, try to have fun with the software and these assignments. I know it's stressful and this is intimidating software and you're trying to get these projects done, but you want this to be fun. That'll make it much easier to learn this stuff. Remember, you can't break anything. You're not sculpting this out of marble. And modeling monsters, animating fight scenes, painting the texture for a spaceship is supposed to be fun. The software can be tricky and difficult to learn at times, but if you try to hold on to the enjoyment of creating anything you want in virtual 3D space, it can make those difficult periods easier to get through. So good luck, have fun, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.